Hey, Kapil.
Test, test.
Yep, I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yep, perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time tonight.
Sure. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. So, as I'm sure you can see, we are recording. Um, Assuming that's all right with you. As far as I've heard, you actually prefer not to have pre-conversations for the podcasts that you've done, at least the ones that I've listened to. Um, I actually prefer it that way as well. And when I started with my initial guests, I didn't, and then had a couple who uh, would get on and be kind of confused as to whether we were like starting for the podcast or just talking. So I started doing just a quick pre-conversation with some people and saying, "Look, like I'll give you some time at the end to tell people where to follow you and everything." And obviously you'll have approval before I release, but I still to this day don't have any meaningful pre-conversations. Is that right? That's something that you like to just get rolling right away?
Sure.
So I have a number of questions I'd like to ask you. I think you have a lot of wisdom and truth that has resonated with me as such. At the same time, I would encourage you to ask any questions you have for me along the way. I really appreciate you taking the time, like I said, and think that this is something that you do for a number of people. Maybe you could start off just by telling those who aren't familiar what exactly you do in terms of coaching, teaching, and alike.
It's, to be honest, very difficult to explain. Essentially, it's the road to conquering the mind and the road to discovering truth in whatever the endeavor happens to be, whether it's life, business, or sport.
And before that, doing that as your main thing, you were a medical doctor. Is that right?
I was a practicing physician, but then this became a natural calling and sort of organically took over, and it sort of became its own thing. So now it's something which is specifically for very sincere and serious individuals who tend to be very high performers, very high achievers in the world of business and performing arts and professional sport.
Yeah, it's very interesting and transparently, I think that I don't see myself as having, and not that you necessarily did when you started, but the credentials to be a coach or to be a teacher. But it's something that I could certainly see myself developing into over time. You obviously started as a doctor, which takes a number of years. And then
the truth about that, I mean, if we're going to discuss the truth, which is the only thing worth discussing, then it isn't about credentials. I mean, even in medicine, the credential of MD gets you in the door with regard to the legal practice of medicine, but getting your MD has nothing at all to do with the practice of medicine. The practice of medicine and the practice of anything has to do with learning the craft. And that is never done in school. That's always done on the pavement. It's always done in the field.
That's fair. I think, well, I guess as a follow-up to that, do you believe that there are different times in a person's life where they could foresee, like for instance, with myself, that I could foresee an interest and a calling and a true wanting to, credentials aside, excuses aside, become that type of coach or something similar, but different and unique from what you are doing at a different stage of life without having the compulsion to do that now? Is that something that you think is reasonable?
I don't quite understand the question.
So to your point, you don't need credentials to be a coach, right? I could, if I really wanted to coach and teach people, I could presumably find clients.
Well, but there's a massive implication in what you're saying, which is not, it's the elephant in the room. The implication in what you're saying is that credentials actually make you competent. And I would say that credentials don't make you competent at all. Credentials what does school know about teaching anybody anything? There's nothing world class about school. To become world class in anything never begins or ends with a credential. So a credential is actually an interference. So the question of you can do it without having a credential implies that having a credential makes you competent at doing it. And it doesn't. It makes you mediocre.
I agree. I think what I was getting at was more so I'm enjoying doing what I'm doing now. I'm recording podcasts, I'm writing, I'm running, and I have a larger degree than I've had in the past amount of freedom, I would say, which I know is something I definitely want to talk about with you. I quit my job a year ago, which is, a pretty objective, something that controls my time. I have to be in an office in a physical location from whatever it was. I was in investment banking, so it was like 10 a.m. to pretty late hours in the night. And then on weekends, I'm glued to my phone and on call and everything like that. Anyway, it was a little bit of a sidetrack, but what I was getting at earlier, I think, was that having the credentials doesn't necessarily enable or teach someone to do something better, to your point. And in the realm of coaching, I'll stick with. But if I was a former CEO and 40 years old or 50 years old and had sold $2 billion+ companies, I would have a far easier time. Not that I couldn't do it with the skill without that experience, but I would have a far easier time, I think, attracting founders, CEOs, athletes, whoever it might be, to become a client because of those credentials. Not to say that it's right or that I would be better at it. Do you agree with that?
Sure. You're basically talking about branding. And so you are using the experience as a credential. And so what you're saying is that credentialed experience of having done that might make those who come to you feel that because you have done that you would know something and that you'd be able to help them in some way. And I guess the only question would be, what precisely is it that they need help with? Because the fact is that the idea of help is it's a very nebulous concept. Human beings all basically search for the same things, and it doesn't. I mean, you're talking more of almost like a mentorship in the form of a coach, and I to be honest, I downplay all mentorships in coaching in general. I think coaching, it's very hard to have these conversations because there are so many things that are not even mentioned that are almost they're taken as being understood, and they're not. You start conversations on the 7th level, and the first 6 are actually non-starters, but they're assumed to be correct, and that's why the conversation begins on the 7th. So even we need to back up like 15 steps and say, well, even what does a coach actually mean? So all the words that you're using, I know how you're using them, not because of you specifically, but because it's the culture, it's the world, it's society. And the way in which these things are used, even the fundament of those, I'm against. I don't think they do anything for anybody. They're just cosmetics. So even coaching someone, I know what you mean by it, and I think it's all irrelevant. I think coaching is irrelevant. I think teaching is irrelevant. And regardless of what you might say that I might do the same thing, I would say, first of all, I have no idea what it is that I do. And second of all, while someone from the outside might, by some stretch, categorize it under the category of coaching and teaching, it is a magnificent stretch to do so. But the only reason that would be done was because there are only so many words in the English language. And so therefore some of the words do overlap. And so you only have so many words to choose from.
Yeah, I agree and appreciate that. I agree with the sentiment of, I don't have a word, like you said, you don't even know how to describe what you do.
Right.
I would hope to like right now, I was trying to explain earlier, I can tell you a bunch of things that I spend my time doing, but I don't have a job, and that's by choice. And that's confusing enough to a lot of people. So when they ask me what I'm doing, it's a very hard question to answer. Transparently, I hope that that's an answer for a large portion of my life, because I think that the closer you are to a definition and the meaning, the societally accepted meaning of a word, whether it be coach or investment banker or entrepreneur, and those are broad words, but still relatively defined to, oh, you're probably spending 40 plus hours a week doing X, Y, and Z.
That's right.
And I don't want to need to do any of those things. If I choose to, so be it. But I appreciate that you can't describe what you're doing, and don't expect you to do so. I'd like to, you mentioned how we kind of started 7 layers in with a lot of unspoken assumptions, perhaps. One thing that you touched at, so I'll just be upfront. I have 5 or 6 on my computer. I have them saved as like key reminders, and they're things I haven't honestly edited them in a couple of years, but they're things that I think you would call truths in the way that you speak. And frankly, I don't call them that because I don't really know for certain, but they're things that I think are worth remembering for myself. And that's why I kind of save them as the key reminders. And I don't even look at it that often. I just kind of know them. One of them is that and I think this is at a pretty like first or second level, hopefully, is that words don't really have any meaning. So when I say coach, you have a certain idea of what I'm talking about. And so, you could argue that there's a meaning there. But then if I say football coach, you have a different idea. So how could coach really have meant any specific thing if another word put in front of it changes?
Coach means prescription. And there is not a single person, including you, in this world who does not prescribe.
So I know what you mean to some extent, because I at least know, I think, how you might describe what you mean. But for those who might want to follow along,
prescriptions are how-tos, our methods, our 5-step plans, our techniques.
Right. So how do you feel about the statement that I made that words have no meaning? And if
I think I think it's abstract. I think, you see, I don't really know who you are, and therefore I don't know the depth of your knowledge. So I cannot say that that where you're coming from is actually truth, because you have many people who say things, and it isn't that they're trying to be disingenuous. It is that their understanding is a cosmetic level, even though the words may overlap. You may have 2 people, one who has found truth and one who hasn't, or even one who is genuinely searching for truth and one who is not. And they both may make a phrase like the one you just said, but one of them is coming from a place of truth, and the other one is coming from a place of non-truth.
That makes sense. I mean, I could tell you I really believe that, but obviously you don't have to believe me in saying that. One question I would have is, how do you get to know someone? Over what time period would you be able to make an assessment that you said you couldn't currently make, not knowing me?
Well, it doesn't really matter what I think of you or anybody else, right? It doesn't matter what assessment I make.
That's fair.
What does it matter what viewpoint I have? It's all about you. Your life is all about you.
Yeah, for me, I guess part of it, and part of the reason I was excited to speak with you today is that whatever it is that you say you do, the way that you speak and the things that you speak about, I haven't had any opportunity to speak with someone, everyone's different, but I think remotely like you in any way. And I've heard people like you speak, and I've read what people like you, and I don't mean to say there's others like you, but I'm not going to put a word on the category, but I could read. So like as an example, like Naval is someone that I understand, I don't know who else, like Yogananda is someone that I've read a little bit. But frankly, most of the truths, I guess, or the beliefs that I've come to put faith in have not really come from others. I'm sure at some point they didn't just like organically sprout in my head, but as one example, I was never a big reader. I've started reading over the last few years, but school, to the point you made earlier, turned me away from it because I had to read so much, and I wasn't a particularly fast reader or particularly interested in the stuff we were reading or the stuff you're supposed to remember or learn from it. So I'm trying to think of where I was going initially. I guess what I was saying is, speaking to you today, it doesn't matter what you think of me, but I was curious to know or to have a sense, because to some degree, based on limited exposure to people in this category, I don't even know myself if I do, like, to what degree I do understand this truth or these truths, and to what degree I am kind of bullshitting. And I'm, I don't intend to, but the number one person I think we all bullshit is ourselves. And so that was the drive probably for me asking what you think.
Yeah, I don't know what I think. I guess my interest and my awareness doesn't really go in the direction of, I wonder if you're genuine or not, because it's kind of irrelevant to me. But if you have direct questions that you'd like to ask, that may be what assists you most.
Yeah. So another thing that I've heard you mention is everything happens for a reason. Can you talk a little bit about what?
Well, I don't know that for a fact. The evidence seems to suggest that, but I cannot state for a fact that is truth. And I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm just, from my perspective, I have not. There's a big difference between belief, opinion, and truth, and the first two don't mean anything. So, based upon circumstantial evidence that I've experienced, it seems to be that way, but there's no point in delving into it, because I cannot say for a fact that is in fact true.
So maybe I was going to ask what you think of something. I'll just share it with no need to respond necessarily, and then ask you another question. But that's one of the other 5 or 6 reminders that I mentioned, is everything happens for a reason. Basically came to realize that, or learn that, and believe that from experience, whether it's true or not. Had a pretty bad freshman year of college that led to a pretty good several years since that I would look back, and if you had asked me if I wanted
but I think that there's a massive difference between correlation and causality. And that, coupled with the fact that the mind sees what it wants to see, makes it almost an unanswerable question as to whether that's actually true or not.
Yeah, so that's what initially exposed me to the possibility that it could be true. The reason I actually believe in it now is I tend to doubt things. Like anything anyone tells me, I have a lot of doubt, right? Or at the, I might.
But I'm going to cut you off just for a second. I mean, like, it doesn't even matter if it's true, because the premise upon which it is based is untruth, which is that everything happens for a good reason. What that basically means is everything happens in one's favor, eventually. And favor is looking for pleasure and looking for self-advantage and looking for things to go one's way. And that in itself is untruth. So it doesn't matter. So it's if the table is untrue, the forks and the knives don't matter.
So one of the ways I think about things like this is, and maybe I should, maybe it would be wise or truer to change this, but I have not been as concerned with the truth as things that work to my advantage. And I think, to your point, that's just false kind of as it is. But that's how I justified everything happens for a reason. I was like, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. If I believe it and it's true, great. I believe in a truth. And if I believe it and it's false, then I just had the sense that believing everything happens for a reason will drive you to kind of make that become true and make good things for yourself. And so I came to the conclusion that it was a good thing to believe regardless of whether it was true or false. But that's obviously different from something that is purely true. And I guess I've had a more difficult time identifying those things. Could you talk about something that you view?
Well, it isn't about identifying them. It's what you're interested in, not that you should be interested in one thing or another. You've mentioned the word belief about 25 times, and it isn't good or bad. There's no wrong or right, but you are enamored by belief. Belief holds something of value to you, and as long as it does, you are not a candidate for truth.
So how do you think about truth? What do you think? What is a truth for you?
Truth is a bedrock truth that is not based upon opinion or belief, and that which does not change.
So what is an example of one?
The self is the cause of all pain.
And that's essentially, so a truth. What's the difference between a truth and a fact?
I don't know. The conversation is getting boring when you go into definitions. Truth is just the truth. Don't go into the Webster's dictionary and try to. You know belief, you know opinion, and you know truth, and it's not belief and it's not opinion. Now, separating truth from fact, I don't know. You get the gist of it.
Right. So let's talk about all source of suffering is from the self, did you say?
Yeah, it is, but it doesn't. I'm not sure you want to go there because it isn't coming from you. And so it's going to come in, it's going to be a 20 questions type of thing, and that's not going to go anywhere. So you got to kind of take it from the place that you have some personal knowledge and experience from, and that you are very interested in exploring.
I've heard other people speaking with you in the past have had sort of moments of silence throughout the conversation. They didn't quite know what to say, and I'm finding myself there now.
And that really isn't me. That's just the power of truth, because truth is uncompromising. It doesn't believe in chit chat. It doesn't believe in exploring concepts on an intellectual basis. It doesn't have any interest in helping people. It doesn't have any interest in whether you understand or not. It renders, truth is the only thing that renders someone speechless, and it transforms human lives.
So I emailed you cold. This is our first time speaking, audio. I asked if you'd like to come on the podcast, and you asked me a question. Is it okay if I share?
Sure.
You,
I don't
you,
even know what I
basically,
said.
you basically just asked, what is your specific motivation for this request? And I responded that I thought I would enjoy the conversation and enjoy having had the conversation. If you don't remember, maybe it was not so meaningful. But was there any reason for asking that as?
Well, I think I followed that up with another email. I think I responded to that again.
Yeah, some of the things that you weren't interested in talking about.
Yeah, I think that's more relevant. You may want to read that.
Yeah, I can reiterate it best I can from memory. It was basically not wanting to talk about prescriptions, how-tos, tips, tricks, things like that.
Yes.
And I may accidentally be asking for those things. I'm not sure if you're implying that. It's not my intention to. I certainly want to respect, this is your time that you're sharing with me. And by the way, if I'm wasting it, we can end it. It's interesting for me to have this challenging conversation. So it's not a waste of my time, but genuinely, if it's zero,
No, you can
interest,
ask what you like. You can ask what you like.
What questions do you typically begin with to your clients, or how do you begin conversations with your clients?
I don't begin in any way. I have no idea what I'm going to say. I don't recall what I did say. There's no briefcase. There's no PowerPoint presentation. There's no 5 steps. I have no clue.
So would you guys just sit there, or they typically start, or you basically
it's just, the cosmetics of it is irrelevant, but the truth is, it is simply an exploration of truth.
Is it okay? I mean, I can ask you questions. I don't know that I should ask you too many like personal questions like I typically do in a podcast. My interest was more so in digging into some of these wisdoms, truths, whatever you want to call it. And I guess I'm not sure whether it's easier to do so in offering myself as an example to some degree, or
you can do it. You can do whatever you feel like. We can just play it however you organically feel. Whatever comes about, comes about.
So one thing you talk about is a universal human desire to feel good, to feel pleasure, that is endless to some extent, because that is, with pleasure comes pain. It's two sides of the same coin, I think you've said. And it gets back to the words have no meaning, that everything happens for a reason, there's no good and bad, there's no right and wrong. They're just, if something is better than normal, then something else has to be worse. Then normal has to be worse. I've thought about this in terms of like my days, almost like when if I have a day that I just don't feel great for whatever reason, I just feel a little down. I think, I need these days. Otherwise, I don't have any good days. If everything was the same, there would be no good. If every like sunset was a beautiful sunset, it wouldn't be a beautiful sunset. Is that accurate in terms of?
Well, the last part you added if all the days were the same, then they wouldn't be any good, or there would be no good. And if all the sunsets were beautiful, then there would be no beautiful sunset. Those are your additions. I didn't say those things.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to imply that you said those things. I was extrapolating my understanding
Yeah,
of
so
a
basically
concept that you've
what you're
introduced.
basically, how you have conflated those things is that you view beauty as good and you view good as good. And because a human being pleasure chases, he chases the good. And therefore, if you take away his good, he doesn't know what to do. So he doesn't mind having the bad because the bad gives birth to the good. And he's more than willing to have all the bad in the world because it gives him the opportunity to have its opposite.
In your view, is there a equal sort of component there where in order to experience amazing, you have to also experience terrible?
They're both the same.
Amazing and terrible?
All of life simply vacillates between one and the other. And as long as there's one, there will be the other.
Why is that?
It's just duality. It is just the way it is. If you look for good, you will experience bad, and vice versa. And the vast majority of the time, it will be bad, with a few shining moments of good. And you don't need to take anything on faith. One simply needs to examine their own life. But human beings believe society, and they believe these nonsense self-help books and these priests and pundits and gurus and spirituality and religion and motivational speakers and the latest bestseller list nonsense. And therefore, they spend their entire life chasing good and running away from bad.
Without knowing that they're both...
Without wanting to know.
Why don't people want to know?
No one's interested in the truth.
Why not?
The pleasure chase. DNA.
So it's
the number of people who have the DNA to seek the truth is extraordinarily small. Why that is, I don't know. The number of human beings who have the power, or the DNA, more the DNA than the power, to rise above their conditioning, or even have the desire to rise above their conditioning, is infinitesimal.
And the two cannot coexist. You cannot seek pleasure and truth.
Well, there's no rule. There just is no, but the search for pleasure is not truth. The search for pleasure is the search for pain. And none of what I am saying should be done or not done or adhered to or turned into a rule or prescribed or is good for you. In fact, I would say it's bad for you. Don't even do it. I hope you vomit if you do it.
Do you consider yourself a seeker of pleasure or a seeker of truth?
Truth is the center of my life. It is my obsession.
You were born that way, or you
That's
grew?
A good question. I'm not sure. If I look back retrospectively, there's always seeds of things in the past. So yes, the seeds of that were there. But it was never to this degree.
And when the seeds were there, but you weren't fully in it, what was like pleasure seeking, for example,
sure,
in the way?
Sure. Absolutely.
It was actively an obstacle.
Well, it wasn't seen as an obstacle.
So one of the reasons that I put some faith into the things that you say, beyond the fact that they largely make sense to me, I guess that might be odd. I don't know. Like, you mentioned it's somewhat of a rare piece of DNA or a rare person's DNA set that leads them to search for truth. I don't know if I'm one of those people. If it's possible to sense a seed, like I would say that I may have one, an inclination for that. But I forget where I was going with that, honestly. One of the reasons I put faith into the things that you say, and maybe that's completely the wrong way of saying it, but one of the reasons I value your time and willingness to answer some of my questions and share your wisdom with me or your truths is that not only were you, not only are or were, I'm not sure, you the, replace whatever word you want for coach, what it is that you do for Naval, who I think is a tremendously successful business person that I might aspire to be like in some ways. And I think he comes from a perspective that is uncommon in the space. And so if you're sharing a lot of these truths that he's buying into so much, it's kind of like a connection of trust. And obviously I don't know him personally, so that could be silly in and of itself, but I think it's possible to trust people based on what they say, even if it's not personally to you. And secondarily, is it true that you have kids who are, and I don't know if this you don't want to talk about, but that are very good at golf?
Yes.
So I think one of the things that I look for always is like, that's pretty objective, right? And sure, they could have for all I know, you could be an incredible golfer, and it could be as much genetics as anything else. But when I see extraordinary success coming from someone who professes to have things worth listening to, ideas, truths worth listening to, that inclines me to believe them, or at least give them the benefit of the doubt for a while. How have you translated what you've come to know to them to lead to their success?
I wouldn't say I led to their success. The majority of any credit needs to go to the people themselves, by way of talent and by way of dedication and by way of, honing their craft. And I would say that it's not anything real specific that I might have said here or there. It's osmosis in many ways. However you are, and, whatever you are, you bring to the table, and whether it's considered good or bad or wrong or right, it's just what you are. And in that, I guess, in some ways that bleeds off both the quote good and the quote bad.
So rather than explicit teachings driving any of their successes,
the explicit, sure, there were a lot of things said, but what the majority of, you never know what your children are going to listen to and what they're not. You could say 25 things and emphasize number 7 and number 8, and you have no idea. In fact, you can almost guarantee that number 7 and number 8 are not going to be the ones that they hear. So it's being a certain way, not trying to be, but just that's the way you are. And that's sort of how those around you become, by taking from you nonverbal and verbal cues that you may, and most of which you perhaps didn't outright teach.
So to that point, I don't want to misquote you, but you've said something along the lines of people become like the environment that they're surrounded by, like the people that they're surrounded by. Have you, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, but have you intentionally sought to redesign your environment as you've progressed on this journey, or whatever you want to call it?
Yes.
How so?
By being alone.
Does that include books and other sources of information?
Yeah, I mean, books have very, very limited value. Books are good for if you want to learn the mechanics of a trade, for instance. But anything that is deep and artistic and, highly intricate, a book can't get you there. Books are basically, in many ways, proselytizers. They have an angle that they want to make you believe. They have a message to send to you, and they have a desire for you to imbibe that message. And that one thing, that one element, makes them largely useless.
It's refreshing to hear because, as I mentioned earlier, I stayed away from books for, I blamed it on school, but who knows really why. I just, like, to a surprising degree, did not read through college, essentially. I would get by in school by going to class and listening and figuring out what was read, and to a good enough degree to do decently. But I didn't read, and I've started in the last few years. I think I've come to believe that, and again, I'm using the word belief. I can maybe circle back to that later, but I've come to believe that the practice of reading is good, and you could say there's no good and bad, but using it as an operating word for the sake of what I'm saying, I think it's a better thing to be doing with my time than playing video games for the destination that I'm working towards, whatever that may be. And I also think that despite my having pretty bad rote memory and retention of what I read, it's probably useful for the type of knowledge that you mentioned, more of like an instruction manual, and obviously not things to be followed religiously, but for the purpose of truth and wisdom, I have always felt that it's not special, to say the least, that the truth can be better discovered. I thought of it in terms of just living and thinking, experiencing, observing. An argument could probably be made for that should be done only, and not only, but that the better piece of that is achieved in isolation. That's not really a jump that I had made, but my mother is an author, and so when I would say something like, I think books are actually dangerous, sort of for the same reason that you mentioned, which is that there's some sort of agenda that the author has, and by blindly reading and trusting every word, you're brainwashing yourself to some degree. And you need to be really careful what you choose, because it's not your agenda. Is this along similar lines of how you think of reading? Are you as cautious when it comes to books as I'm sort of interpreting?
I genuinely don't read books because I'm not interested in prescriptions. And there's no books that don't offer prescriptions. Like I said in the beginning, everyone is brainwashed and conditioned to give and receive prescriptions, There's no author out there who's writing books without prescriptions. Therefore, for me, there's no book to read.
But you've written books, and I've written quite a bit this past year and prior. Why? I can try to answer the question myself, but why is it that for myself, but why for you do you write, or did you write?
I write because I have to write.
You feel there's no choice?
Yes. At my fundament, I'm a writer. It is something that comes to me. It is the medium through which I explore.
Is there anything else that you have to do?
Discover truth.
Is there anything beyond those two things?
What's left?
So if you keep it at that,
well, as opposed to what? What else is there?
Yeah, I don't know. Read, exercise, eat.
But you're talking about basic functions of living. I don't think that you were asking that question a minute ago. I don't think that you were asking, do you eat or shower? I thought you were asking in the vein of, is there any other activity or any other pursuit that you're involved in?
Yeah, eat was a different, you're right, that was a different question, or in response to a different question. I think people would describe reading, and some people might describe reading and what was the other one I said? Exercising as a compulsion or something that they feel they have to do, or starting a business.
Again, that's a daily living thing. That isn't a pursuit. A person doesn't exercise 19 hours a day. They don't live to exercise. That's just something that's one of the things they do for, quote, health or whatever it may be.
So let's look at writing then versus writing. You're creating words, right? And messages and whatever it may be. Is it fair to compare in a similar category building a business as something one could feel compelled to do?
I mean, there's no wrong or right. Whatever someone is driven to do, he's driven to do.
But you don't put that in a separate category like my prior examples, which probably didn't make sense. You think that's an appropriate thing in the same category?
Sure. Yeah. It's whatever your calling is. It's whatever grabs your heart.
You mentioned earlier that this pursuit of truth is something that happened organically for you over time, that it was a calling. To me, and I don't want to get into the semantics of the words, but calling I think of as like immediate realization of sorts, whereas organic implies a long-term trend towards something. Which or where in between was the case for you?
Yeah, I don't like definitions. They don't go anywhere.
I guess I don't mean to ask you to label it as much as shed light on your experience of moving towards where you are now.
If you're asking how it happened, I don't know.
This might be a little different, but another thing you've spoken about is how no person who is great at anything can really describe exactly how it is that they do it.
Yes.
But most people try. You don't it's a
Most people
useless.
do a lot of things.
Yeah.
What does that have to do with anything? As if trying does anything. What is, if something isn't truth, what does it matter if you try to do it? Everyone caters to everyone else. All of human action is based upon ego and vanity. So to try to show someone because you want to help them, or because it makes you feel good, or because you want to show off, or even if it isn't to show off, just because it makes you feel like, it's the ego of the helper. Therefore you try, and therefore you check the box of trying. What does that have to do with anything? There's only truth and there's not truth. That's all there is. How much effort you put in, what you tried, it doesn't matter. There's no credit. People like to assume there is. You get credit for trying, and you get credit for helping your fellow man. You don't get credit for anything. There's just the truth, and there's not the truth. And the most insincere question that anybody could ever ask at this very juncture is, then what is the truth? Because that person who asked that question doesn't really want the truth. They just want some words that they can call the truth. And maybe a more accurate representation of the truth, and maybe perhaps a more specific representation of the truth, is the maniacal and obsessive and devotional search for truth. That'll eliminate everybody.
Sorry, can you say that again? Maniacal.
If you want to stump me, ask me to repeat. I don't know what I just said.
Okay. Well, let's just take maniacal, which I think of, is that, just to give me, I don't exactly know what that means. That's obsessive, basically, right? Like a maniac.
Yes.
So yes. An obsessive desire or want, you might have said, and just take what I'm saying and tell me if it's rings true. But basically that you're talking about an obsessive drive for truth, which, if I remove the ultimate destination of truth, obsessive drive, I think, is at the root of anyone who does anything extraordinary. I hesitate to make overarching comments like that, so I might pull it back a little bit. But with a lot of people, it's an obsession that drives to levels that wouldn't be believed. Are you obsessed?
Yes.
Do you agree that obsession leads to extraordinary outcomes, unlike other characteristics that people might have?
It does, but it doesn't matter. Because the person who becomes obsessed for an extraordinary outcome is not truly obsessed.
They would only be, if anything, obsessed with that outcome to some degree.
Yeah, they're just, using it as a clever trick. It isn't what you choose. It's what chooses you.
How does someone open themselves to being chosen, if that's...
No, that doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, I guess that's a prescription.
Absolutely.
Well, I know we're coming up on the time that I had scheduled, and this is about the longest silence I've had thus far, so maybe it's just time to end. I'll give you, if you have anything else to say, obviously the floor to do so, but appreciate you making the time today. Certainly a different conversation for me to have, and one that I'm looking forward to listening back to. So thank you very much for your time and perspective.
Certainly.